I do love that classic House of the Dead music. Yes, welcome back, and that music tells you one thing and one thing alone. I am once again Random Gamer Riven, and today is the next in our series of Gaming Nightmare videos. Yes, this is Randomised Gaming's Gaming Nightmares Volume 3. And today we're going to be looking at a rather well-known horror on the Sega Saturn. In fact, one of the possibly worst known RPGs. It's a joy and a wonder to play, as always, reliving it as I was playing it. And yes, I am being slightly sarcastic there as we look at Virtual Hydlide. I think this very name of this game will strike fear into the heart of quite a few Sega Saturn players out there. In fact, to quote the classic TV series Nightmare, enter stranger. As much like Nightmare, 3 players had to guide a 4th player around the arena in wearing a helmet who was completely blind to what was going on and who was clueless to what was around him. Much like in Virtual Hydlide, in fact, as if you're foolish enough to play the hard difficulties, you not only play as a hero with absolutely no equipment to begin with, but you also have no direction or no idea what on earth you need to be doing or where you need to be going. So it's a bit like the blind leading the blind. Now, as you can probably tell from the very footage that I'm just about to demo now, it's a truly terrible RPG. It was infamous at the time. But to explain, Virtual Hydlide was done by T&E Software. It was also the 4th game in the Hydlide franchise, with Super Hydlide, the previous game, being on the Mega Drive, and 2 previous games, the original and the second Hydlide, starting life on the MSX and a number of other home computer formats. Interestingly, the original Hydlide was also ported to the Nintendo Entertainment System, and it's often misquoted as being a clone of Zelda. Well, in many ways it is a clone of Zelda, because Zelda almost certainly copied a lot of the gameplay from it, because the original Hydlide was released way back in 1984, quite a few years before the original Legend of Zelda game, but it was only ported to the NES much later, hence why the confusion has often occurred. It is a very early Sega Saturn RPG, and, well, on the good side, it's short, doesn't take long to finish. And that's probably about it, sadly. Right from the very beginning, even seasoned RPG players may suspect something is amiss with Virtual Hydlide, notably due to the fact the game features a scoreboard, which you don't normally see in RPG due to the fact most people play RPG for the narrative story and not to play a game to collect points and see how high your score is. Indeed, the scoring system as a whole is rather badly implemented. One, because it creates an annoying system where if you have a high score every time you die, you have to then put your name on the scoreboard, and you will be dying an awful lot in Virtual Hydlide. The other thing is the scoreboard also acts as a point system for you to spend in the shop. So it's not an XP counter, level ups are only limited to preset events, but in terms of if you want to buy anything in the shop, you have to spend points. Any gold you accumulate will be added to the scoreboard as well. It makes it a bit of a slightly weird system, as it's purely for buying stuff at the shop and for scoring how well you do, and it's the how well you do system just simply doesn't need to be in this game. This is an RPG, and most RPG players play it for the story narrative or to enjoy the frenzy of the battles, and unfortunately in Virtual Hydlide's case it has neither of these. As soon as you actually start in game, you will notice the first worrying sign is the fact the player character, who is an appallingly badly digitalised actor, moves and controls like a tank. There's no other words to describe it. If you've played Resident Evil, you'll remember the original game had tank controls for Jill and Chris, as people often joke. However, those tank controls in Resident Evil were a blessing to the controls in Virtual Hydlide. This character is so slow to turn and manoeuvre that fighting enemies from behind you is an absolute nightmare. It's awful. Even moving left and right is slow chundery. It's just all over the place. And as you can see, the controls are certainly not helped by the frame rate. As I say frame rate, I'm not entirely sure if it's a frame rate issue with the way it judges, or whether the game has been developed partly to have a sort of turn-based system in a live-action environment, because everything seems to be stilted like a stop-motion animation. There always seems to be a pause between every action, everything you do, so the whole world, nothing flows smoothly, and it all looks very disjointed and jerky, to put it mildly. This isn't helped, as mentioned earlier, by the just atrocious digitalised actors. Not to mention that, there's only a handful of digitalised characters. Most of the enemies and locations are either in 3D graphics, bad 3D graphics, or a 2D sprites. And as you can see here from a few of the enemies I'm fighting as 2D sprites, such as the zombie or the imp, their sprites look absolutely woeful. You can barely work out what they are. In fact, I've seen SNES games and Mega Drive and even NES games with better looking sprites. They're just horrible. What I can only describe as a mess. The zombie is just ugh. And then there's this bat thing that just flies around as well. At least the vampire boss makes a vague resemblance to Dracula, but everything else is just ugly. There's no denying getting away from it. Even the dungeons are pretty lame and lamentable. The other major killer for this game is the fact there's just simply no story whatsoever. After the opening intro where we see a Valorous, I believe the villain's called, who's been the antagonist as some people like to say. I just like to say villain. In all the existing Hydlide games, he kidnaps the princess and then away you have to go to save her. And that's it, that's all the story. Now bizarrely, the other thing that's even more weird is the fact Hydlide, unlike many RPGs, has a difficulty setting. It has easy, normal and hard. Now these don't actually change the difficulty of the monsters or enemies you fight. They don't even change when you get level ups, etc. So all the level ups are preset for after you complete a level or a location. What they do, however, is basically decide how much of the map is filled when you start and if there's a location pointer to where you're supposed to go. Now, in Easy's case, you get the full map and there's a location pointer. In Normal's case, the map is unrevealed at first, so you have to go around revealing it, and the pointer still points to the location. On hard, the map you have to reveal again. However, there's no location pointer to where you need to go. So if you haven't played the game before, you have no idea exactly which location to go to progress in the correct order. What's even more bizarre is whoever designed the structure of the story missions clearly didn't do them properly, because you can actually hugely sequence break. In the first location, the graveyard, you pick up a holy cross that's needed to defeat the vampire mansion. Once you defeat the vampire mansion, you get an item, a lamp, to go and explore the trial dungeon. Herein, in fact, comes the first sequence break, because you can actually explore the trial dungeon without the magic lamp. The location is light enough, even without the magic lamp, to be able to wander to the objective to pick it up. Now, and the other thing is, you don't even need to do the trial dungeon as well, because the trial dungeon gives you an item called, it's a magic all-seeing eye that lets you see. Fourth location is the ruins. And that is basically a sealed castle that you can only enter with this magic eye. The thing is, the magic eye only makes you see the door. The door is always present even if you don't have the magic eye. So you can even go through and enter this location as long as you know where the door is without the magic eye. The clincher being, there is always a signpost, and the signpost is always just to the right of the entrance to these ruins. So in effect, you always know where the ruins entrance is anyway, and you don't need the magic eye. And as you can see from this video, I just entered it without the magic eye, and then there's a version of me, I'll show a quick clip of me entering it with the magic eye. It makes a complete mockery of the first half of the game because you don't actually need to do any of these items. Now, technically you can enter the fifth location as well, the volcanic cave. However, that has constant flame damage, and I believe if you went there first, your health would be too low in order to survive it. But effectively, the first three locations in the game, you don't need to visit whatsoever. You can just sequence break out of them. And what's to add to the matter, as I said, on hard mode, to make it even more crazy, is the fact the map doesn't show you anywhere. So of course, if you've not played the game before, if you decide to be brave and do hard first of all, you've got nowhere to go. You have to explore the map to find out what you're going to do. Add to this the fact on hard mode you don't have any equipment when you start, means you have to head to the graveyard to pick up some equipment. As you may have noticed in the start of the game, this game has a very unique feature in that each time you play, it creates a random world. This random world creates how the world map will look and what items are available in each location. It sounds very cool. But on the downside, what it does mean is often, as I found, you go into the graveyard and there's no weapon for you. So effectively you're bare-fisted in hard mode. Even in the video you'll see I was playing normal mode and I didn't get a sword till about the fourth dungeon. So the first three dungeons I was just left with the default club. If that happens on hard, you're going to spend half the game with basically your bare fists, unless you look for the shop, which is another location hidden around the map. Now, there's no pointer to the shop. The game doesn't even mention it in the manual when I was reading. It might do in the Japanese manual, but certainly not in the European manual. There is a shop that's a crystal. If you're on hard mode, as you have there's no pointing to any objectives, and that never points anyway, and you don't have the map reveal. So on easy, you can see where all the key locations are from the get-go, and you just have to keep going to know which one is. Unfortunately, all the key locations show up as yellow blobs, so you usually don't have any idea which one this shop is, although the slight hint is that the shop's usually in an open field. But this makes the game incredibly frustrating if you're doing hard, because if you don't get a decent weapon from the graveyard, you're then going to have to grind out for hours in order to get high enough score in order to be able to purchase a weapon from the shop. And trust me, the shop is not cheap in the slightest. The items are incredibly expensive, so if you don't have enough points, you might be farming enemies for hours. Added to this, the enemies on the map give you next to no experience, so effectively, if you don't get something decent from the graveyard when you first start hard, you might as well just simply restart the game. There is supposedly another difficulty pro if you finish hard, but I've not seen that difficulty myself. I can't even comment if that unlockable is true or not, as I've never actually finished Hydlide on hard, although I have previously, and I must admit guiltily, finished Hydlide in the past. On top of this, there's nothing quite as annoying in an RPG. Okay, you can save anywhere, which is a blessing, because there's plenty of one-hit kills. Such as here, enter the fairy forest looking for one of the fairies to help you save the princess, punch the wrong tree, killer bees, instant death. Walk through hidden trap, instant death spikes, as you can see here. Ouch, that hurts. I mean, there's quite a few instant deaths as well in other places, and it's just quite a painful experience. And the simple truth is, having one-hit kills attacks in a roleplay game defeats the point of any sort of armour or level up system benefit. It just shouldn't be here. If you've got better armour and better equipment, you shouldn't be killed outright as if you're a level 1 character to if you're a level 10, but it does happen in this game, and it's just really bad design. And finally, we have the equipment system. So if that wasn't bad enough, the equipment system has been designed like it's an early 80s RPG. You don't often see the perks what a lot of the items give you, and on top of that, many of the items are just completely random what they are. So for instance, unless you have a scroll of reveal, there's no way of telling what they are. And the other factor is, like when you pick up scrolls, they're unrevealed in the first place. So when you pick up a scroll, you don't know what scroll you've got. Is it going to curse an item? Is it not? The other thing is, I found is during this my playthrough, there was a selection. I went to one location in the mansion and I picked up a magic ring. Now, I foolishly equipped that magic ring, and it turned out this magic ring was cursed. Once you're cursed, you need to get a scroll of purification from the shop in order to uncurse, unless you pick up one randomly. However, because I was cursed, I couldn't then equip the crucifix in order to kill the vampire boss. So effectively, I had created a non-prog situation where I was then going to spend ages by farming points and then trying to find the shop in order to uncurse myself. Sure enough, all I did was just simply start, bring up the menu and reload my save, as there was no way I was going to do that. But this is another problem with the random pickups, and the fact that items are completely hidden until you either equip them or use a scroll. Now, the scroll of reveals are incredibly rare in game, so often it's just pot luck that you just have to save, equip the item and hope for the best, and just hope it's not cursed, or else you're going to be spending ages farming and looking for the shop. The equipment system is pretty bad, and not only that, there's also equipment weight as well. You weigh too much, you won't be equipping the gear, and this means early on you can't equip the best sword with the best shield, which kind of defeats the point of a lot of the equipment if everything's weighted. It means you can only have the best armour and the sword on, you can't use the best armour and shield until you're an incredibly high level. Systems like this, while they work well when implemented in games such as Skyrim, this game simply used it to a degree that's just not that well put together, and it was just does not work. In all, there really isn't much saving grace for Hydlide whatsoever. It's just a really bad game, and it's easy to see why this was the last in the Hydlide series. It plays like a very old RPG. It looks terrible for a 32-bit system and one of the early Saturn games. This should have been a prime Saturn game, and had it been good, it would have no doubt been successful. It was a very early Saturn game, but it simply wasn't the case. It was a terrible, terrible game. And as RPG goes, it's still ranked as one of the worst, with only the Japanese Heirs Adventure probably being worse than it. So as always, what should have you been spending your cash on back in the 90s instead of this rubbish? And just before you all go, Shining Force 3, Panzer Dragoon Saga, I'm not going to discuss them because they are not live action or real-time RPGs like the Zelda franchise. Hydlide was, so I'm only going to talk about the really good live action RPGs on the Sega Saturn. Basically games like Zelda, which some of you may have heard of, some of you may have not heard of. So sorry guys, if you're looking for tactical games or turn-based ones, then Panzer Dragoon Saga and Shining Force 3 are it, but they are not live action RPGs where you control characters in real time. So first off, speaking of Shining Force 3, I'm going to recommend the first Shining game released on the Sega Saturn, that was Shining Wisdom. Shining Wisdom was an enjoyable real-time live-action RPG that followed the events of just after Shining Force 2. Now, the game was started life on the Mega CD and then eventually finally found release on the Sega Saturn after some years in development. Combat-wise, the collision is not as good as it should be, but it's still an enjoyable game. It's very puzzle orientated, much more so than Zelda, and there's a great and amusing selection of items, including everything from mole claws to dig underground, and an array of magic spells to help you confront your enemies. The story's quite good and the plot is very well put together. It complements the Shining series as always, as they had a huge running story, and it follows just after Shining Force 2. In fact, a few of the characters from Shining Force 2 make their appearances in this game, and it also ties up some of the loose ends from Shining Force 2 as well. Overall, it's a really fun game, and with some great jokes in it, like the toy donor car where there's even a mock little racetrack to run around. It's great fun to play. It has a great soundtrack, and there's just a huge variety of puzzles to solve in it. I really enjoyed it when I played it back in the 90s, and it's still an excellent game even now. There's a ton of secrets and bonus items as well. How many other RPGs can you say can't give you a judo suit or even a sleeping pyjamas costume? Now my next recommendation is for Climax's superb Dark Saviour. It was a semi-sequel follow-up to Landstalkers on the Mega Drive, and its rather unfortunate semi-sequel called Lady Stalkers, which was on the Super Nintendo. But this is the third in their trilogy of isometric adventure games, although as with the previous two games, none of the characters are connected, but there's a few sort of nods to the previous ones. This game follows Garion, who has to escort a criminal, Brian, having previously captured him, to a prison island. You transport him on a ship, and while on there, he escapes and wreaks havoc. What Dark Saviour's unique playing point was that during the opening section on the ship, you were given a timer, and depending how quickly you were able to get to the ship's cabin to capture Brian again, depended what happened. Were you able to get there before Brian arrived, or Brian, I should say his name's technically pronounced. Were you able to get there before he actually arrived at the captain's cabin? Were you able to get there just as he was there defeating him, or were you too late to get to him? The way the game was set up was the first time round you were always going to be incredibly late to the captain's cabin, and so you'd always do the first parallel. After that, depending when you arrived in the cabin would ultimately depend on how the story would unfold. There are effectively five different tales within the game, whether you won or lost to Brian, and how he went on the island, with the opening parallel being incredibly depressive with everyone getting slaughtered along the way, and the later parallels enabling you to capture Brian early on and thus explore the problems within the island. It was a very unique story system that hasn't been used again, but it was a brilliant game. My only slight gripe with it is the combat is a little bit, they tried to do a Street Fighter style burst fighting system that didn't quite work as well as it should have done, but it's still a good fun game. You could also capture characters in combat, so as you went on you gained more characters to fight with. The system itself, as I said, the parallel system was wonderful and gave you a unique story point on it every time. My only slight gripe is it always felt there should have been a sixth and final parallel to finish off the story, but there never was. So my last recommendation, and possibly the best live action game on the Sega Saturn, is The Story of Thor 2, or as it was known in the US, The Legends of Oasis. Yes, this is the sequel to The Story of Thor or Beyond Oasis on the Mega Drive, and is a superb follow-up. Graphically, it's fantastic, uses some beautiful 2D animation, really, really lovely. And also the soundtrack was done by well-known Streets of Rage 2 composer Yozo Koshiro. In fact, it was developed by Ancient, who was his actual company, and it is a fantastic live-action RPG. It's beautifully done. One of the cool facts with it is there was actually a hidden 2-player mode in it, so if you fancy a friend you can unlock this cheat and play in 2-player, but it's a wonderful game. It's not that long, only about 5, 6, 7, 8 hours, but it's beautifully done. It's a really, really good Zelda clone. There's some fantastic combat sections. It's just so well put together. Everything shines through, and it shows up Virtual Hydlide in every aspect. And bizarrely, it even has a ranking system like Virtual Hydlide, but it's just a bit betterly done. It even times you on how long it's taken to finish the game and how many items you collected, etc, etc at the end. So those are the nice factors. That do you go for 100% items or do you go for the top speed? Admittedly, I don't like these systems in either game, but it's still a nice extra. In fact, as I mentioned earlier, it's probably the only extra that people might keep coming back to play Virtual Hydlide. As Virtual Hydlide is so bad, it's become a bit of a so bad it's good game. while I must admit playing it for the first time, it still feels awful and terrible. There's a slight guilty pleasure about playing it and just trying to finish it, even though it's just as bad as what it is. I mean, you can speed run it in, from what I've seen, in about an hour and a half or something stupid. The game is incredibly short. This is the only one redeeming feature, is the fact that it has this bizarre time scoring system, if you're mad enough to do it. Quite why you'd want to time attack this game and not Story of Thor 2, I don't know, but Virtual Hydlide has picked up a representation of being so dreadfully bad that it's actually quite good. And yep, so if like me you have guiltily played through it in the past, shake your head in shame. But yes, there is one slight redeeming feature. It is one of these games that even I say, if you played it once, just to see how bad it is. But as a whole, to sum up Virtual Hydlide in one word, one time a friend of mine was watching it when he played it, and he looked at the character as he walked and replied to this: that guy walks just like John Wayne, with the horse still between his legs.